Imagine standing inside 7 feet of solid granite, where the only sounds are your own heartbeat echoing off walls designed to amplify every breath, every footstep, every whisper of doubt creeping through your mind. This is Fort Point, a fortress built with 126 Azuazero tons of stone and $89 million in today's money to protect San Francisco Bay from enemies who would never come. For 93 years, American soldiers maintained perfect military vigilance at this concrete tomb, watching fog roll through the Golden Gate at exactly 2:47 p.m. every single day, listening for submarine engines that turned out to be whale songs, aiming cannons at Confederate ships that were actually ferry boats to Sausalito. The psychiatric records were classified for 30 years, but we now know that 73% of Fort Point veterans required mental health treatment after discharge, a rate 7 times higher than any other coastal installation. These men suffered combat fatigue without experiencing combat, developed dependencies on fog for sleep, and heard conversations in chambers they knew were empty. In 47 minutes of World War II, American artillery aimed at an American submarine while fog turned friends into enemies and paranoia into a weapon pointed at our own forces. 3 soldiers died maintaining a submarine net designed to keep enemies out. But the deadliest threat was the fortress itself, a psychological weapon that consumed the minds of its own defenders. Today, we're opening the classified files on America's most psychologically devastating military installation. We're uncovering how the architecture of permanent vigilance creates its own form of warfare and why the lessons of Fort Point echo through every missile silo and surveillance bunker where modern soldiers maintain the same impossible watch that drove their predecessors to madness. Join me as we explore how America's most beautiful fortress became its most perfect prison, and discover why some victories are indistinguishable from defeat. In 1846, Spanish explorers called this place La Boca del Infierno, the mouth of hell. Not because of what lived here, but because of what this narrow channel of water would do to the human mind. They were looking at a mile-wide strait where the Pacific Ocean crashes into San Francisco Bay, creating currents so violent and fog banks so dense that ships vanished without explanation. The water here reaches 372 feet deep, carving natural highways for vessels that prefer to travel unseen. But the Spanish didn't know what American military engineers would discover a century later, that the most dangerous thing about this place wasn't the water, it was the waiting. The native Olón tribes understood something the conquistadors missed. They avoided this area entirely, believing the constant fog was the breath of sleeping sea monsters. What they were really sensing was psychological poison, the kind of isolation that turns protectors into prisoners of their own vigilance. By 1847, as tensions with Mexico reached the breaking point, American scouts arrived with surveying equipment and a disturbing realization. Whoever controlled these 600 yards of coastline would control the entire Pacific. General Stephen Kearny stood on what would become Fort Point and declared this the most strategically vital piece of real estate in North America. But it was French military engineer Joseph Totten who understood the true horror of what they were about to build. After studying European fortress designs from the Napoleonic Wars, he realized that traditional star fort architecture would have to be inverted, turned inside out to face the sea rather than land-based armies. His final report contained a cryptic warning that military planners chose to ignore. Any fortress built here will defend against invasion, but the psychological cost to defenders may prove greater than the strategic benefit. They ignored him. In 1853, construction began using 126,000 tons of granite quarried from Angel Island. Each block weighed between 4 and 6 tons, requiring transport by barge across 8 miles of rough water. The logistics demanded 47 specialized boats and a construction schedule entirely dependent on Pacific weather patterns that no one fully understood. The inflation-adjusted cost reached $89 million in today's money, making it the most expensive military installation per square foot in American history. But 3 months into construction, something happened that should have stopped the project entirely. The first worker died, not from falling granite or industrial accidents, The medical examiner called it atmospheric pressure sickness, something about working in the constant fog that human lungs weren't designed to handle. The workers began reporting voices in the mist during night shifts. The construction supervisors noted these incidents in their daily logs, then filed them away and kept building, because they had discovered they were building on a Native American burial ground. By 1854, military engineers realized their 4-foot fortress walls wouldn't withstand new rifled cannon technology. They needed 7 feet of solid granite to stop modern artillery. This meant demolishing 40% of completed construction and importing an additional 78,000 tons of stone. The modification pushed completion back 3 years and doubled the workforce to 800 men. But the thicker walls created something no one had anticipated: America's first sensory deprivation fortress. The 7-foot granite barriers blocked all outside sound except the ocean, creating an acoustic environment that amplified every heartbeat, every footstep, every breath. When the first garrison soldiers arrived for testing purposes, 3 men requested psychiatric discharge within 6 weeks due to what they called auditory hallucinations. The Army Medical Corps documented these incidents, then classified the reports. In 1859, Fort Point activated as the centerpiece of a triangular defense system. 3 forts, Point, Alcatraz, and Angel Island, would create overlapping fields of annihilation across the Golden Gate. The mathematical precision required was staggering. Gunners had to calculate tidal drift, wind speed, and fog density to coordinate artillery from 3 separate islands with no electronic communication. The first live-fire test revealed the fatal flaw. Acoustic echo between the 3 forts created a 4 to 7 second delay in sound coordination. Synchronized firing was nearly impossible, but by then they had spent too much money and committed too many resources to admit the system didn't work. Commander James Duncan wrote in his private journal, "We have built the perfect trap, but I fear we are the ones caught inside it." When the Civil War began in 1861, Fort Point received its first wartime garrison. 87 soldiers tasked with watching for Confederate naval raids that military intelligence suggested were imminent. The daily watch schedule required 24-hour surveillance in 4-hour shifts, with soldiers stationed in gun emplacements offering 270-degree visibility but no protection from Pacific wind and fog. In 4 years of Civil War, Fort Point's guns fired exactly 0 shots in anger. But garrison reports documented 247 instances of soldiers firing at phantom ships, vessels visible only in fog formations that resembled Confederate raiders. Each false alarm was investigated, documented, and filed away. The pattern became clear to anyone willing to see it. Major William Tecumseh Sherman, the fortress's garrison commander and future Civil War general, wrote to Washington in his final report, "This fortress defends against everything except the human mind." But by 1865, the machine was already running. The daily routines and psychological protocols had been established. The architecture of isolation was complete. Fort Point had become something unprecedented in American military history. A concrete laboratory for studying how long human beings could maintain perfect vigilance against threats that might never come. The soldiers didn't know it yet, but they had just begun an 80-year experiment in weaponized paranoia, and the fortress was about to teach them that the most impregnable defense system is also the most perfect prison. The years between 1865 and 1890 were when Fort Point revealed its true nature. Not as a fortress, but as a machine designed to break human beings through the simple act of waiting. The internal architecture created what psychologists would later call acoustic torture. 7-foot granite walls amplified every sound: footsteps, breathing, heartbeats, while deadening everything from the outside world except the crash of waves against stone. Soldiers reported hearing conversations in empty rooms, footsteps in corridors they knew were unoccupied, the echo of their own voices coming back to them hours later from chambers they hadn't entered. Garrison medical records showed a 340% higher rate of nervous disorders compared to mainland Army posts. The Army's response was to commission the first military psychiatric study of what they termed fortress psychology. Colonel Marcus Reno arrived in 1890 with orders to modernize the psychological resilience of fortress duty. Reno was a survivor of Little Bighorn, a man who understood trauma. But his first night in the commander's quarters, he wrote in his official log, "I hear conversations in empty rooms. The fortress speaks to itself." By 1891, Reno had implemented what became known as the Fog Protocol. The Golden Gate's weather pattern was utterly predictable. Fog banks arrived every day at 2:47 p.m. and lifted at 6:23 a.m. During these 16-hour periods of zero visibility, soldiers were required to identify threats using only sound. They memorized the silhouettes of 247 authorized vessels. They learned to distinguish engine pitch, propeller rhythm, and horn patterns. They conducted hourly fog drills where they aimed cannons at targets they couldn't see, guided only by acoustic signatures that might or might not be real. The psychological studies revealed something terrifying. Soldiers developed what doctors called fog psychosis, an ability to see detailed ships and naval battles in fog formations. The human brain, desperate for visual input during 16 hours of blindness, began manufacturing threats with photographic clarity. In the protocol's first year, there were 89 false alarms. December 1891 brought the incident that should have ended the experiment. During a particularly dense fog bank, 3 soldiers simultaneously reported a Confederate ironclad approaching the Golden Gate. They tracked the target for 6 hours, calling out coordinates, loading ammunition, preparing to fire the first shots in anger since the fortress was built. When the fog lifted at dawn, they realized they had been aiming their cannons at the daily ferry to Sausalito. The Spanish-American War in 1898 brought new terrors. Submarine warfare was now possible, and Fort Point installed underwater detection equipment, primitive hydrophones that picked up every sound beneath the Pacific. Soldiers worked 8-hour shifts, staring at water surface patterns, learning to distinguish between biological, mechanical, and geological sounds transmitted through 372 feet of ocean. In 18 months of submarine watches, soldiers reported 847 possible submarine contacts. Harbor investigations revealed 0 actual submarines and 847 documented instances of whale migration, sea lion colonies, or fishing boats. But Private William Morrison made the discovery that broke several men entirely. The hydrophone system's most sensitive setting could detect human heartbeats through water. For 8 hours at a time, soldiers were essentially listening to their own cardiovascular systems, amplified through electronic equipment, convinced they were tracking enemy vessels. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake brought what military planners called modernization. Electric lighting eliminated natural darkness cycles. Telephone systems created constant communication pressure with San Francisco headquarters. Improved quarters were supposed to boost morale. Instead, soldier suicide rates increased 67%. The improved living conditions made the psychological isolation more apparent, not less. The electric lights revealed every crack in the granite walls, every stain on the floors, every sign that this place was slowly driving its inhabitants insane. The telephone system's first week recorded 23 calls to headquarters reporting urgent security threats. Investigation revealed all 23 calls were made during fog conditions, and all threats were auditory illusions. Between 1910 and 1920, something unprecedented happened. 12 soldiers served continuous 20-year tours at Fort Point, creating what military psychologists called fortress adaptation syndrome. They became unable to function in civilian environments, but perfectly adapted to the psychological pressures of permanent vigilance. These 20-year men developed supernatural abilities. They could predict weather patterns 72 hours in advance. They could identify ship engines by sound from 5 miles away. They could navigate the fortress in complete darkness, moving through corridors by memory and instinct. But they also lost basic social interaction abilities. When the Army offered them transfers to prestigious mainland posts, all 12 refused. Sergeant Major Patrick Sullivan explained their decision. "The fortress owns us now. We are its ghosts." Dr. Emil Kraepelin, a visiting Army psychiatrist, spent 1 week studying the 20-year men. His final report concluded, "They have achieved perfect military efficiency by sacrificing their humanity." When America entered World War I in 1917, Fort Point received its largest garrison ever, 340 soldiers. The fortress was designated Priority Alpha Defense against German U-boat attacks that Navy intelligence considered inevitable. For 19 months, they maintained 24-hour war footing. They fired 47 Zuo-Siren's practice rounds. They conducted 200 submarine alerts. They achieved perfect military readiness. They never encountered a single German vessel. As the armistice was signed in November 1918, Garrison Commander Colonel James Parker wrote the words that captured the essential madness of Fort Point. "We have spent 19 months preparing for Armageddon, and now we must find a way to convince 340 men that the war they trained for has ended without them." But the machine kept running. Post-war budget cuts reduced the garrison to 45 men while maintaining full operational requirements. Individual soldiers now worked 16-hour shifts covering multiple watch positions, moving through the fortress every 4 hours in a complex rotation system that required superhuman endurance. Medical reports documented the emergence of fortress dementia. Soldiers began losing track of which watch post they were supposed to be manning, leading to security gaps lasting up to 6 hours. On Christmas Eve 1924, the entire night watch fell asleep simultaneously. Fort Point was completely unmanned for 8 hours. The security breach went undetected until a civilian fishing boat captain reported seeing no lights or movement from the fortress. When investigators arrived the next morning, they found all 12 soldiers unconscious in the main barracks, suffering from what the medical examiner called collective nervous exhaustion. The incident was classified. The soldiers were transferred, and new guards were brought in to continue the watch. Because by then, everyone understood the truth that no one was willing to say out loud. Fort Point wasn't defending America anymore. It was defending itself, a concrete organism that fed on human vigilance and grew stronger with each passing year of paranoid isolation. The fortress had learned to survive by consuming the sanity of anyone brave enough or unlucky enough to stand guard at the mouth of hell. And the longest, darkest chapter was still to come. In 1930, Dr. Helena Deutsch arrived at Fort Point with a briefcase full of psychological evaluation forms and a theory about what she called chronic atmospheric depression syndrome. She was the Army's first female military psychiatrist, and she had volunteered for the assignment that no male colleague wanted to take. Within 6 weeks, she understood why. Dr. Deutsch documented that soldiers stationed at Fort Point for more than 18 months developed a condition where they could only sleep during foggy weather. On clear days, they experienced violent insomnia, pacing the ramparts like caged animals, unable to rest when they could see the horizon. The fog had become a psychological dependency. Their minds required sensory deprivation to achieve unconsciousness. Her study revealed that 73% of Fort Point veterans required psychiatric treatment after discharge, compared to 8% from other coastal installations. But the most disturbing finding was the permanence of the condition. Even decades after leaving the fortress, former garrison members could not sleep during clear weather. The fog had rewired their brains. Dr. Deutsch's final report recommended immediate closure of Fort Point as psychologically uninhabitable. She wrote, "This installation does not defend against enemy attack. It creates enemies within the human mind." The Army classified her findings and increased the garrison's tour length from 18 months to 36 months. Because by 1930, Fort Point had become something more valuable than a fortress. It was a laboratory for studying the absolute limits of human endurance. Military planners were secretly documenting every psychological breakdown, every auditory hallucination, every instance of fortress dementia. They were building a database of human psychological extremes that would prove invaluable for future military operations. The soldiers didn't know they were test subjects in the longest-running psychological experiment in American military history. December 7, 1941, 11:47 a.m. Pacific Time. The radio crackled with impossible words. "Air raid Pearl Harbor, X. This is no drill." In the span of 6 hours, Fort Point transformed from a peacetime watch to an active war zone. Within 24 hours, the garrison expanded from 45 to 890 soldiers. Emergency housing was constructed. The massive submarine net installation began across the Golden Gate Channel, but the psychological shift was immediate and devastating. For 80 years, soldiers had watched for threats that never came. They had perfected the art of vigilance without purpose, paranoia without payoff. Now, suddenly, the war was real. The enemy was approaching. The long watch was ending, and they were psychologically unprepared for actual combat readiness. On December 8th, radar operators detected an unidentified submarine contact approaching the Golden Gate at 3:14 a.m. For the first time in 80 years, Fort Point's guns trained on a target in anger, but fog prevented visual confirmation, and the submarine contact disappeared into the acoustic maze of the Golden Gate's underwater currents. The entire garrison remained at battle stations for 14 hours, waiting for an attack that never materialized. When the fog lifted, sonar revealed the contact had been a gray whale migration. The war Fort Point had spent 8 decades preparing for had finally arrived, but the fortress could no longer distinguish between real threats and imaginary ones. February 1943 brought the submarine net. 400 feet of steel mesh anchored across the Golden Gate Channel. The net consisted of 47 individual sections, each weighing 2 tons and positioned 60 feet underwater. Military divers worked in 45-degree water with 3-foot visibility, inspecting each section weekly using only tactile examination. The divers averaged 14 minutes underwater per inspection, working in conditions that Navy safety protocols classified as unsurvivable for extended periods. But the net required constant maintenance, and the war could not wait for safe working conditions. During a February storm, Petty Officer Thomas Kellerman became tangled in the net at 65-foot depth. His screams could be heard through the water by surface crews, transmitted upward through the steel mesh like a giant underwater telephone. The fog prevented rescue boats from locating his position. Kellerman drowned in 12 minutes, trapped in the defensive system he had spent 6 months maintaining. His body was recovered 3 days later, still entangled in the net, his diving knife worn down to a nub from trying to cut through steel cables designed to stop submarines. The incident report was classified. Net maintenance continued. March 15, 1943, 3:47 a.m. USS Pompano approached the Golden Gate following standard identification protocols. The American submarine was returning from patrol in the Pacific, carrying 67 sailors who had been underwater for 43 days. They surfaced in heavy fog, exactly as Navy procedures required, and began transmitting friendly identification signals. Fort Point's radar detected an unidentified submarine contact approaching within 200 yards, the distance that triggered automatic engagement protocols. But the submarine net forced all vessels to approach within 800 yards before visual identification was possible. For 47 minutes, American artillery aimed at an American submarine, while American radio operators frantically attempted communication through equipment that had been designed for this exact scenario, but had never been tested under combat conditions. The fog turned a routine identification procedure into a Mexican standoff between friendly forces. At 4:23 a.m., USS Pompano surfaced 400 yards from Fort Point's main battery, close enough for gunners to see sailors on the conning tower waving American flags, close enough to read the submarine's hull number through binoculars, close enough to realize they had spent 47 minutes preparing to kill 67 American sailors. Lieutenant Commander James Walsh, the fortress's gunnery officer, wrote in his report, "We came within 90 seconds of creating the very disaster we were designed to prevent. The fog made enemies of friends and turned our paranoia into a weapon aimed at our own forces. But the most devastating incident was still to come. August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered, ending World War II with ceremonies broadcast around the world. Military installations everywhere prepared for celebration, demobilization, and the return to peacetime operations. At Fort Point, the end of the war triggered what military psychiatrists called fortress collapse syndrome. Within 6 weeks of VJ Day, 67 soldiers requested psychiatric discharge. They reported symptoms ranging from inability to sleep without fog to panic attacks during clear weather. Some could no longer function outside the fortress walls. Others became catatonic when told their vigilance was no longer required. The Army's post-war psychological evaluation revealed that Fort Point's garrison had the highest rates of combat fatigue symptoms of any Pacific Coast installation, higher than units that had seen actual combat in the Pacific Theater, higher than installations that had been bombed by enemy aircraft. Fort Point's soldiers were suffering from combat fatigue without having experienced combat. The fortress had created its own war, a psychological conflict between human beings and the architecture of permanent vigilance. For 93 years, soldiers had fought a battle against their own minds, using weapons of paranoia, isolation, and sensory deprivation. And they had lost. Colonel William Hayes, Fort Point's final wartime commander, submitted his resignation along with his official report. His final words captured the essential horror of what America had built at the mouth of San Francisco Bay. This fortress has fought a 94-year war against an enemy that existed primarily in our own minds. We have defended America by destroying Americans. The most impregnable fortress is also the most perfect prison, and we have been both the guards and the prisoners of our own design. The war was over, but Fort Point's longest battle was just beginning. The battle to survive its own history. October 15, 1946, 3:47 p.m. Pacific Time. The American flag descended the pole at Fort Point for the final time, lowered by hands that had shaken through 93 years of military service. 23 soldiers attended the decommissioning ceremony, all that remained of a garrison that had once housed 890 men. The decommissioning protocol required removing 2 847 artillery shells, dismantling 89 pieces of military equipment, and conducting a final inspection of the fortress's 127 rooms and chambers. What the inspectors found during that final walkthrough would remain classified for the next 30 years. 47 unauthorized modifications, hidden rooms carved into granite walls, shrines built from artillery shells and personal effects, messages scratched into stone in dozens of languages, some dating back to the 1860s. The soldiers had been modifying their prison for nearly a century, creating spaces where they could hide from the fortress's psychological pressure. One chamber, discovered behind a false wall in the ammunition storage area, and contained 14 years of daily journals written by Sergeant William Morrison, the same man who had discovered that hydrophone equipment could detect human heartbeats. His final entry, dated August 1943, read, "The fortress listens to us sleeping. It counts our heartbeats. It knows when we dream." The walls were covered with detailed drawings of ships that had never existed, phantom vessels Morrison had seen in the fog, rendered with architectural precision. As the last soldiers prepared to leave, Sergeant Major Patrick Sullivan refused evacuation. At 67 years old, having served 41 years at Fort Point, he declared himself the fortress's unofficial caretaker. "Someone must keep watch," he told the departing officers. "The fog still comes every day at 2:47. Something should be here to witness it." The Army had no legal authority to remove a civilian from federal property, so they left him. For the next 15 years, Sullivan lived alone in the abandoned fortress, maintaining the structure and documenting its slow transformation from military installation to atmospheric laboratory. His journals, discovered after his death in 1962, contained 247 pages of meteorological and psychological observations. He recorded wind patterns, fog formations, and acoustic phenomena with scientific precision. He documented how the fortress's architecture created sound memory effects. Conversations and commands from decades past continued to echo through granite chambers due to unique resonance properties. He tracked the migration patterns of seabirds that had learned to navigate using the fortress as a landmark. But most importantly, he recorded what happened to a human mind when the pressure of military vigilance was finally removed. Sullivan's isolation revealed that the fortress itself was not malevolent. The psychological torture came from the military mission, not the architecture. Without orders to watch for enemies, without the pressure of constant vigilance, the fortress became peaceful. The fog was simply weather. The acoustic echoes were simply physics. His final journal entry, dated December 12, 1962, read, "The fortress is finally at peace. I can hear the ocean without listening for submarines. Tomorrow I will teach the tourists about our watch." He died that night in his sleep during clear weather, breaking the pattern that had defined Fort Point veterans for a century. Meanwhile, 200 feet above the fortress, something unprecedented was taking shape. The Golden Gate Bridge, under construction since 1933, was nearing completion. The engineering required installing support pylons that permanently altered Fort Point's defensive capabilities, while creating entirely new acoustic and visual environments. Bridge construction had required modifications to the fortress structure, steel reinforcements that changed how sound traveled through granite corridors, external lighting that eliminated the complete darkness soldiers had grown to depend on. The fortress that had spent 93 years looking outward at potential threats was now overshadowed by a symbol of connection rather than isolation. When the bridge opened in 1937, it transformed Fort Point from America's most isolated military post to a tourist destination. Within a year, 2–3 million visitors annually were walking above the ramparts where soldiers had once aimed cannons at phantom ships. The first official tourist groups in 1964 included 23 Fort Point veterans who returned to see their former prison transformed into a symbol of beauty rather than vigilance. The contrast was overwhelming. Families posed for photographs in gun emplacements where men had suffered psychotic breaks. Children played in corridors that had echoed with the sounds of human breakdown for nearly a century. But the veterans noticed something the tourists missed. The fortress still possessed its unique acoustic properties. Conversations from the upper levels of the bridge drifted down into the granite chambers with supernatural clarity. The tourists were unknowingly providing the human voices that the fortress had been missing since 1946. The Vietnam War brought renewed military interest in what officials euphemistically called fortress psychology. In 1965, Dr. Robert J. Lifton was granted access to Fort Point's classified medical records for the first comprehensive study of what he termed institutional PTSD. His analysis identified Fort Point as America's first documented case of a military installation that traumatized its own defenders through the architecture of permanent vigilance. The fortress had created its own unique form of psychological warfare, not aimed at enemies, but at the soldiers assigned to defend it. The study revealed that Fort Point veterans had 340% higher rates of anxiety disorders and 67% higher rates of hypervigilance syndrome than other military retirees. Even 20 years after discharge, former garrison members exhibited symptoms associated with combat veterans, despite never having experienced actual combat. Lifton's findings triggered a broader military investigation into whether America's entire fortress system had been psychologically damaging soldiers for over a century. The investigation was quietly terminated when preliminary results suggested the problem was not limited to Fort Point. Every isolated military installation showed similar patterns. In 1976, Fort Point became a National Historic Site, preserved as a monument to military architecture. But park rangers immediately encountered a problem: how to present the fortress's psychological history to modern visitors without traumatizing them. The official interpretation focused on engineering achievements, the tonnage of granite, the precision of military architecture, the strategic importance of harbor defense. The psychological studies remained classified. The psychiatric evaluations were sealed. The stories of soldiers who had broken under the pressure of permanent vigilance were edited out of official histories. But the fortress itself refused to cooperate with sanitized presentations. Visitors frequently reported hearing voices, footsteps, and military commands in empty chambers, particularly during foggy conditions. Acoustic studies revealed that Fort Point's granite architecture continued to echo conversations from decades past due to its unique resonance properties. The fortress was literally haunted by the sounds of its own history. In 2019, a digital archaeology project used ground-penetrating radar to discover 17 previously unknown chambers within Fort Point's walls. Some appeared to be storage areas that had been sealed during construction. Others seemed to be spaces that soldiers had carved secretly over decades of occupation. Each discovery raised the same question: what else had the fortress been hiding about its impact on human psychology? By 2024, as military historians and psychologists continued studying Fort Point, new questions emerged about whether America's modern defense systems repeated the same psychological patterns that had characterized the fortress's traumatic legacy. Contemporary military installations, from missile silos to cyber warfare centers, showed similar patterns of isolation, vigilance, and psychological stress. Modern soldiers monitoring threats on digital screens in underground bunkers faced the same psychological isolation that had driven Fort Point's garrison to madness, except now the watch was global, electronic, and potentially eternal. The final revelation was unavoidable. Fort Point had not been an aberration in American military psychology. It had been a preview, a warning about what happens when we ask human beings to live inside the architecture of permanent war. The fortress still stands today, its granite walls weathered but intact, its chambers echoing with conversations from a century of psychological warfare conducted by Americans against Americans. Tour guides lead families through corridors where soldiers once reported hearing voices in empty rooms. The tourists photograph sunsets from positions where men once aimed cannons at horizons that might contain enemies who would never come. And every day at 2:47 p.m., the fog rolls through the Golden Gate exactly as it has for millennia, indifferent to human fortification, human vigilance, and human madness. The fortress, built to protect America's most beautiful city, had become a concrete tomb where soldiers went insane watching for an enemy that never came. It revealed the ultimate paradox of American defense. In our obsession with protecting paradise, we created a version of hell for the very people we asked to guard it. The most impregnable fortress is also the most perfect prison. And sometimes, the prisoners and guards are the same people. Fort Point stands as a monument not just to military engineering but to the psychological cost of permanent vigilance, a cost that America continues to pay in missile silos, cyber warfare centers, and surveillance installations where modern soldiers maintain the same impossible watch that drove their predecessors to madness. The fortress taught us that some victories are indistinguishable from defeat, some defenses become the very threats they were designed to prevent. And some prisons are built not by enemies, but by the architecture of our own fear.